Welcome back to chapter 27, where really things start to pick up, and you're going to really identify a lot of works within this chapter. It's a long chapter, and we're getting into a lot of the more modern movements. Some of the things that to keep in mind as we move through this chapter is sort of the setting that's getting painted with the politics that artists are responding to. We see the revolution in France and a new ruler in Napoleon. We'll eventually even get into more of the Industrial Revolution and how population explodes. And we have transportation and masses of people and goods going back and forth and back and forth. Um, and neoclassicism will slowly fade away into sort of romanticism as we see a style that wants to encompass more emotion and feeling for the mainstream style of art. To talk briefly about Napoleon and also then look at the artist that we pretty much ended up in the last chapter with David is here we see him again. And uh, once Napoleon is in power, he employs lots of artists to show that power, to see that propaganda again, which is nothing new, right? We've seen this all the way back even to the Medici's using it. Uh, and here he was not a supporter of David. David actually was imprisoned at the time, but he offers him sort of this pardon and says, "Hey, if you paint for me and kind of give me this career, I will, I'll give you your life back." And so David takes it, right? So he was not a Napoleon sort of fanatic, but he gets his life back and to continue painting. He basically would do anything for painting, but he ends up kind of selling his soul a little bit. But I think he hides a lot, and this painting is a monumental scale of painting, and uh, it and it just kind of shows what Napoleon wanted from his artists. And he employs architects and any artist in any medium to sort of like push his power and his image. But Napoleon is also inspired though by Roman art and wants this mimicked in the creations that he's asking these artists to do. And um, And so David being the best painter, right? When we think neoclassicism, Napoleon wants that. He wants that that sort of talent on his team. So he's given the title as first painter of the empire, and um, and continues to sort of make work for Napoleon. This what's kind of interesting is what we see here is not Napoleon being crowned, but Napoleon crowning his wife. And what's really interesting is notice that the Pope is in the background of the witness. Usually the Pope would be the one doing the crowning. So we have this sort of weird juxtaposition that David gives us that shows us just kind of all that's going on. And similar to almost like a Rembrandt painting, though, when we think of all the portraits of things going on, David does the same thing. So all the crowd around him, right, are very specific people. He's kind of like, we don't have photography yet, so he's having to take that snapshot of every single individual of importance that was there. Really, though, whether they were there or not, we don't know all of them. But if they all were there, it just kind of goes to show Napoleon's power. This was held in Notre Dame, and we know that because of the architecture that's seen. And that's sort of just a credit to David and and what he's able to portray for us. Other images of Napoleon, though, and definitely watch the YouTube link, um, is comes from actually students of David. And here we see uh, Napoleon almost as a Christ-like figure, where here he is healing the sick. He's walking through, and everybody else seems to be repulsed, but here he is. I'll touch their wounds and heal the afflicted. So, pretty interesting depictions all around of what Napoleon's having created. But this is sort of the mythical status that he creates, and this is actually of the city of Jaffa when it's stricken with a bubonic plague. And he did visit it. Napoleon did visit this, so there is a little bit of accuracy going on. This work um, comes from the greatest student that David had in John August Dominique Ing, as it's pronounced. he wins the Prix de Rome at the age of 21, and is kind of considered sort of a genius, kind of like like a Mozart of painting. And the link will give you even more sort of individual details about this work. But the thing that you have to pay attention to is we've seen earlier sort of the classic odalisque reclining nude of the female body. And here we're seeing in sort of a different pose of it. Instead of being open up to us, right, we have the back. So there's still a seductiveness to it. Um, but it's a little bit more closed off than we've seen before. But we know that this is still sort of like a lavishness, right? The grand odalisque, right? This idea, which is actually referencing a Turkish sort of harem or in the bazaar. So we know that this is still sort of a scene of prostitution, but at the same time there's richness and there's lavishness, and right, we're sort of taking a peek, but everything's just covered ever so much. Um, Ing was always searching for the ideal form in the human body, which is really kind of weird because here he's actually elongated it, right? You can see how much longer the hips are as that spine moves down. He was greatly influenced by the Greeks, and this painting itself, kind of interesting enough, was painted for Napoleon's sister, which yeah, I guess you could read your own into that. But he uses that classical reclining nude that I talked about, and which comes from the Greek structures and sculptures there. The head is proportionally also too small, and the limbs themselves seem to either be elongated or too small. Like nothing really fits, but at the same time, it does to create this flow that really fits the entire canvas. I did say that this is in a Turkish harem, but items from the Orient are super popular at this time. So people want images that sort of show that, especially if you own them, just like we'd seen before. We want to sort of flaunt what you have. When it was first shown, people hated it, and it took about 6 years for people to stop complaining about it. We have all these complaints that show after show, and so it's interesting to now how proclaimed it is, but really it was hated when it first came out. Now it's this great symbol of sort of the romantic style that we have in art. So romanticism, what is it? Where did it come from? Great film on Canopy to watch. I highly recommend this. That's why I put all those links in there, and you'll find the Romantic Rebellion there in your Moodle shell as well. While Neoclassicism responded to the Enlightenment specifically, Romanticism was inspired by Rousseau in his statement that man was born free, but is everywhere in chains. Right, so the Romantics wanted to gain freedom from political, emotional, religious. They wanted freedom of speech, and especially for artist creativity. They believed in imagination and feeling. So we see a shift from reason to feeling in these artworks. One of the biggest names that started it was a poet, painter, and known more for his prints is William Blake. And I gave you a link there for one of his poems, so you can sort of understand the symbolic nature of the work. So the work are true illustrations for the poems. But many of them came from his dreams. They were mixed with classical references, and are sense to sort of like evoke feelings of the sublime and terrible, right? This image, like I said, is a part of a poetry book, is also has sort of biblical proverbs attached to it, and so we have God sort of like unleashing His power down below, and when you see the sort of the series of work, you can see where he's sort of mixing in a lot of things. It's not purely biblical, but it's not purely from mythology either. So Blake is a very interesting character. Another one and another printmaker is Goya, and his images also done in sort of a series. This one titled "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," but comes from a whole set of prints, which I posted for you on your Moodle shell. You can go through and watch all of them, and through this YouTube link as well. You can watch the film on Canopy. It's amazing, and this work, though, is a part of a series of etchings called the Los Caprichos, and this caption, right, and the sort of the language that's there, is sort of the imagination abandoned by reason, and sort of the impossible monsters that are united with uh, with the mother of arts, and that becomes sort of the source of wonder, right? So the artist team with imagination produces just an endless abyss of ideas. And Goya was really haunted by what he was seeing going on in Spain, and this will link back to Napoleon a little bit. Is that one of his most important pieces, the 3rd of May, happens because Napoleon. So basically, Spain is still independent from France, but is struggling with its own sort of civil war, and is asked, and then so Spain asked for Napoleon to come in and help them sort of curb that and help to sort of regain order. So he comes in, and after the Civil War is done, Napoleon just says, "No, country's mine," and he appoints his nephew to rule Spain. So now all of Spain is kind of, they're pretty upset. So they revolt, and on the 2nd of May, there's some Spanish troops that are killed. And so and Goya actually did paint that piece as well. But here we're seeing the next of that, the 3rd of May. And so what we see is Napoleon's troops, killing these men uh, that are innocent. The second piece of this shows the people who actually did it, and none of those faces are seen here. Um, and this is sort of one of those stunning pieces where Goya he's just sort of painting in this expressionistic style to convey this actual historical event. And, we see the sort of nameless and faceless soldiers, just firing upon the innocence of those who do have a face, right? That do have an identity, and they're just being torn down and blown away from it. We do have, once again, sort of a figure with a Christ-like pose, right? Almost like bearing a cross, right? We see that same sort of pose again here with the arms spread. So a lot of religious and sort of innocent nature, right? The idea of using that white, and we have that bright emphasis right on the viewer. Goya sort of became haunted by these scenes that were coming up all the time within the Spanish landscape. And while he was a court painter and did a lot of portrait and stuff, he eventually kind of drives himself mad. And so in his later years, he's deaf, he's partially paralyzed, and he's blind. And so he's kind of exiled to his home, and he paints this piece. And it's sort of a reference to how Zeus and how Zeus is was birthed out of the head of Saturn, and so he eventually disposed of that. But here he is eating his children, right? He's afraid of what's going to come because he's told that one of his kids will kill him, and eventually he does. And then the link itself explains this pretty well. But this is actually painted on the wall, and so as a fresco, and so that to to be preserved some of these pieces, and later they had to literally cut the wall and remove that. One of the most famous of the Romantic period, and definitely have to watch this link, is uh, Gericault's Raft of the Medusa. It is a narrative on a true story. Where sort of an inept captain, and they eventually, goes out with his crew, and they sink. And from this true story, right, which is a horrible story about how the survivors had to resort to cannibalism, anything to sort of, stay alive. But we see that classical triangular composition, leading us up and then back through as we go from death to sort of hope of life, and then back through to the death, and sort of, we continually do this. And right back here is right that hope of a ship they're waiting down. And I believe that there were like 13 survivors of almost a couple hundred. But this piece is sort of like a hallmark for the Romantic period and that romantic style of artwork. We'll come back here in part two with more of these works.